Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Amanda Hendrix-Komoto from Montana State University. Not only is she the author of Imperial Zions, but she's also a bit of an abortion expert, both 19th century and modern. So we're going to talk a little bit about the allegations of abortion against John C. Bennett. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. I want to change the subject a little bit because you are you're into, I don't want to say family studies. You tell me, how do I say it?
I mean, you could just say like women's studies.
Women's studies, okay.
Yeah.
Because I understand you are kind of the go-to expert by like Doug Fabrizio and that sort of a thing. When there's a feminist issue in the LDS Church, a lot of feminists in the LDS Church don't like to talk about it. And you're not Mormon, so you can talk about it.
They can't excommunicate me. I think you're dancing around what I actually talk about, though, because I'm not just like feminist issues in general. They always contact me when they want to talk about abortion and reproductive rights.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I get contacted for. So I went to the University of Michigan, which has one of the oldest women's studies programs in the United States. And they have resisted changing to gender studies because they want to recognize that history. And so when I was in graduate school, I was surrounded by people who were doing gender and women's studies and the history of sexuality. And many of my friends, because we also had a strong historian of medicine, were historians of childbirth in particular and reproduction. And one of the things that really frustrated me was when I heard not just Mormon scholars, but people within Idaho and Utah talk about birth control, the history of abortion and sexuality. It was completely ahistorical and completely detached from the scholarship that had been happening from the 1970s on. And so one night I decided, I got an invitation to write about the history of birth control and abortion in Utah from the Exponent 2/Dialogue, because the Exponent 2 was editing an issue of Dialogue. So I accepted.
Oh.
And then because I have small children, it did not get done. And then I knew I had to do it, and so I did it in like 2 days.
Oh my.
And I wrote an article that basically took what scholars of women and scholars of childbirth and medicine had been talking about for decades and applied it to the history of Mormonism and Utah in like, I can't remember how, maybe 8,000 words. Okay. And so it was quick and it was dirty. But part of the reason that I was so frustrated is women's understanding of their bodies, and I'm sorry that you have to listen to this as a middle-aged dad, and pregnancy have changed over time. One of the things that changed is how women, and you can just go la 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 for a second, how women talk about menstruation. I mean, for most women in the 20th century and 21st century, it's a periodic monthly thing, and that's not true for everybody. But in order to have that, you have to have good nutrition. You can't be working too hard or else the strain on your body will stop you from menstruating. And for a lot of women in the 19th century, and even Latter-day Saints, although I have never seen anybody actually do research on this, women who are walking great distances, who aren't going to get a lot of nutrition, in other words, like women on the Mormon Trail, are likely not to be menstruating because they're anemic or their bodies are just being worked too hard. Your menstruation will stop. And we don't talk about that. We don't think about it. Women understood.
Men really don't think about it.
No. I had a graduate student. He's finished now, and he wanted to do a dissertation on Trek. And I was like, okay, you can do that, but you have to talk about teenage girls menstruating on Trek and like how the male leadership dealt with that. And bless his soul, he took me up on that, and
Wow.
he found out like what the different ways people had dealt with it on Trek. Some horrifying and some more humane.
Oh no.
Yeah, girls being forced to like cart tampons with them the entire way, not being allowed to throw them away, or only being allowed access to like 19th century methods, which is just, yeah, imagine your poor kid like trying to deal with that. And
is that because we're trying not to litter? Is that the idea?
The idea is, well, I think that is for like carrying it the whole way. I think there are some people
just to show the hardship that the pioneers would have done.
I like to think it's out of an environmental ethic, but probably your answer is closer. But also, I think for some people it's about like not being anachronistic. Like, oh, they wouldn't have had those in the 19th century, so you can't have them with you either. Oh. I would like to think that most Trek leaders are sane people who would not push it that far, but there are a couple stories that are just horrifying that he found. But the way that women...
So he was doing like oral interviews to find out this stuff?
Some, and he was looking on like internet forums. A lot of people have posted about their experiences on Twitter, on Facebook, on ex-Mormon Reddit, on Mormon Reddit. People have written blog posts about it. People really like to talk about Trek. So he was able to find, I think originally he had planned to do oral interviews, but he's a high school teacher and has 4 kids, I want to say. And so not surprisingly, he found that he didn't have as much time to do oral interviews as he had anticipated, which is a common story. So he didn't end up doing it.
So internet research is a lot easier.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to fit in while you're dealing with a 4-year-old. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he did it based on internet research.
Wow.
But the way that women have understood pregnancy has changed too. If you think to the time before we had easy ways to tell about you're pregnant, women didn't really in the 19th century have a surefire way. There's a whole bunch of folk stories about how you can tell if you're pregnant, some of which involve killing animals and then peeing on things. It's very, very wide-ranging, and we can talk about anybody who wants to know. I will email you the ways that they used to determine if a woman was pregnant. But a surefire way, though, is when you feel the baby kick, which they called quickening, which I assumed that everyone knew what quickening meant, and I've learned that's not true. But quickening is the moment when a woman can first feel a fetus move, and it moves earlier with each pregnancy.
Oh.
Because you've been pregnant again, and you can sort of recognize those feelings. And so...
How big is a child to be when you can feel them kick? Because I don't know. I have no idea.
20 weeks?
20, so that's pretty far along.
If you're like a first-time mother.
Okay.
And it can be earlier than that. It really depends on the woman.
So you're halfway done by then.
Yeah, well, and if you imagine, like, there are many reasons why a woman can stop menstruating. And only
what about
one of
morning
them,
sickness? Wouldn't that be the first sign?
I never had morning sickness.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
Oh, wow.
Women have a wide variety of experiences during pregnancy.
My wife had morning sickness.
Oh, tell her I'm sorry. If it makes her feel... I had horrendous back pain that caused from my joints getting too loose. But women's experiences during pregnancy vary a lot.
Okay.
And so not every woman gets morning sickness. Not every woman has her period stop. You can have a period and still be pregnant. And so for a lot of women, because they couldn't do an ultrasound right and see a heart beating, the first time that they really knew they were pregnant for sure was when they felt the baby move. And before then, if your menses had stopped, or your menses is short for menstruation, or is it?
Okay.
Yeah. So they would refer to it as...
I should tell you, my master's thesis or project was on fertility ratios or fecundity ratios, but I didn't go anywhere near this deep into stuff.
I will send your advisor an email. They should have made sure.
He's a fertility doctor, so he knows all about that. I might be writing a paper with him. We'll see.
Oh, well, you can... I'll send you a bill for this information. So they would call it having stopped menses.
Okay.
And your menses can be stopped, right, because you haven't had enough food or you're getting too much exercise. Lots of different
nutrition was much more poor in the 19th century, right?
Yeah. And so women could take pills to restart or regulate their menses. And these pills generally they would put things in them like tansy, pennyroyal, that would cause the uterus to contract. And if you take a lot of those, a high concentration, it can cause an abortion. But if a woman was taking that, she wouldn't know whether or not she was causing an abortion. In her mind, she doesn't know if she's pregnant. She doesn't know if her menses have just stopped because of nutrition issues. There's a whole host of reasons. She just wants to restore her menses. And so sometimes when women took these, they'd be having what we would consider an abortion. They wouldn't have considered it that. Abortion for them starts once you know you're pregnant.
Well, see, this brings up a whole issue of, John C. Bennett, was he inducing abortions among women of Nauvoo?
Yes.
And
I don't think he would have had to for them to have abortions. So every family in the 19th century often would have their own home recipes to do this sort of thing.
So they would take natural products.
They take teas.
To induce an abortion?
They wouldn't have called it that. They would have thought of it as restoring their menses, because in their mind, they aren't pregnant yet, because pregnant starts when you can feel the baby kick. And in fact, Brigham Young says that the soul enters the fetus when you feel the baby kick. And that kick that you're feeling is the soul entering the baby. And so they don't consider it an abortion. They wouldn't have used that language. They would have said they're restoring their menses. But yes, in fact, I think I'll have to check. I'm pretty sure it's Heber C. Kimball talks about in one of his sermons how common it was for people to call women midwives, generally, to administer these sorts of teas. He says it was as common as wheat. He's giving this talk in Utah. In the mid-19th century, understandings of pregnancy begin to change, not because there's any new scientific understandings. There are none, actually, in that time period. But doctors who, before this time period, hadn't been involved in childbirth, begin to argue that we need to push back our understanding of when pregnancy begins. And so during the 19th century, you have this uneven change in how women and men understand pregnancy, moving it further back into time and moving concepts of when you can have an abortion further back in time.
See, this brings up another thing, because there was one of my favorite books, and I'm really trying to get Angela Poley Hudson on.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know her? If you know her, tell her to talk to me.
I haven't seen her in years, but I have met her at a conference. We have talked a couple of times. So I've met her, but we're not like tight friends.
Okay, well, see what you can do. She wrote one of the best books I've ever read. It's called Real Native Genius. It's the story of Warner McCary, who was he claimed to be Choctaw Indian. He's actually a former slave. Honestly, it's a crazy story. But at any rate, he married Stanton's daughter.
I don't remember her name, but I've read the book.
And so they go to the East Coast pretending to be Indians, and Warner disappears from the record. But she gets arrested for performing illegal abortions, I want to say in the 1860s.
Yeah, so this is part of this change. So what happens...
Oh, okay. So in the 1840s, you're saying they wouldn't have used the word abortion? Well, because there's all those allegations with John C. Bennett.
Yeah, so it's patchy.
Okay.
So starting sort of mid-century, ideas about pregnancy, abortion, when pregnancy begin to change. And people adopt them patchily. In fact, in the 90s, there's a midwife whose last name is Sorensen. I'd have to think maybe Hannah, but I'd have to check her name. She is very much life begins at conception. But what she writes is that it is disappointing how many Mormon women in the 1890s don't believe that there's anything wrong with causing an abortion before quickening. And what's going on there is you have an older standing of abortion against a newer one.
Oh, okay.
And so it changes over time, right? I mean, that's the way it always works. Things change closer to cities, and then the rural areas, people hold on to sort of, the knowledge hasn't permeated out there necessarily yet. And so there's always this patchwork understanding of what pregnancy is, even among Latter-day Saints. So what the first initial laws against abortion are actually poisoning laws. As you might imagine, in the 19th century, there's very little control over what goes in sometimes teas, sometimes pills. And women do get poisoned and die from these pills and from these
because they would put mercury and lead in some of these things. So
who knows what's in them, right?
Toxic.
You don't know what this random guy has put in your pill.
Alvin Smith basically died of mercury poisoning.
Yeah. No, seriously.
The medicine to cure him killed him.
Yeah. So that happens with women as well. And so several women die from these pills and these teas. And so there are regulations that are put in place. At first, it's poisoning laws. But then as doctors start to argue that we need to push back our understanding of when birth begins, these increasingly become regulations about abortion and birth control.
And so they didn't understand that it took 9 months for a baby to be born? Was their knowledge that bad?
I would have to check and see what the actual, how long they would say a pregnancy was.
Okay.
I mean, the question is also who didn't know, right? Because like a medical doctor is going to have a very different understanding than a midwife, who's going to have a very different understanding than your average everyday woman.
Okay.
And so the question is like, who would know? But for them, like, when your period is stopped but quickening hasn't happened, you're sort of in an intermediate state where you might be pregnant or you might not. And so the for sure pregnancy begins at quickening, but there is, you do have some idea that you might be pregnant before then.
For a first-time mother, she wouldn't experience quickening until about 20 weeks.
Yeah.
What about for a 9-time mother?
I mean, it can be as early as like 14, 13 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a moving target, and I can't remember for the life of me when I first felt my children move. Who knows?
Probably you already had peed on something and not knew, right?
No, it's true. I knew before, like, I missed a period. Because I was trying. I did not, yeah. Well, and I should say, like, I don't think that this history necessarily means that you have to feel one way or the other about abortion. Because you can easily argue that they're misunderstanding what's going on, they don't know, and that we have a better understanding. But I do think, like, if we're going to talk about these things, that we all need to actually understand what's going on. Otherwise, the arguments are not founded on anything. They're founded on misunderstandings. So yeah, in sort of as the 19th century progresses, you get more and more laws against abortion until you get to the end of the 19th century, and almost every state has an anti-abortion law. That's also when you get the Comstock laws, right, in the 19th century, early 20th century, regulating sexuality and birth control. They're arresting women who are handing out birth control. But what's happening is you have women losing control over their ability to...
Now, are they using, like, medicines as a form of birth control?
So you could. So one of the things I have in my office, which sadly we are not in, is a birth control, or like an abortion pill tin, which I ordered off the internet. I did not get one with the abortion pills inside because I didn't want any small children to find them and then like think they were edible. But you could take one as a regulating pill if you wanted. It's not something I would suggest doing, but they would also have birth control teas. A lot of families in rural areas would have their own personal recipes. One of my students is from Wyoming, a former student, MA student, PhD student eventually. She has a family story in which her grandmother, I think, was cooking her own pessary, which is an internal birth control method, is all I'm going to say. And a salesman stopped by, thought that it was fudge, and popped one in his mouth and ate it.
Oh, no.
And so, like, this is early 20th century Wyoming. Like, women had their own at-home methods that worked to varying degrees. I don't want to say, I always feel really tenuous talking about this stuff because of the overturning of Roe. Whenever I talk about this stuff in class, I'll have a female student writing it down as like a how-to, and it's like, stop, there's better ways. Like, you don't want to be doing any of this.
Right.
Because it's going to make you sick. Like, there are better medications out there, right, for birth control than like your grandma's home recipe. But yeah, so women had the ability to control their own reproduction, and it wasn't always perfect, and it often failed. There were many unwanted pregnancies and unexpected pregnancies. but they had the ability to do that. By the end of the 19th century, you're getting really sad letters from women to doctors and midwives and birth control activists begging for information about how to prevent pregnancy, because many of them are having child after child after child and can't tell their husbands won't listen to no. And they know that their bodies can't take it anymore. And they're writing, just asking, begging, knowing that this information is legal, asking, like, how do I prevent a pregnancy? And then...
That's really sad.
Yeah. The women, if they sent the information back or the male doctor sent the information back, they could be arrested, but they did it anyway. Madame Rastel, a friend just wrote a biography of her, is a famous birth control provider in the 19th century who was arrested many, many, many times. But John C. Bennett's actually interesting. So I have many questions about John C. Bennett, but one of the things that I find interesting about him is I looked him up in like newspapers.com, and then BYU also has a copy of a pamphlet that he wrote describing how to deliver children. What's interesting about him, and again, I do not speak French, so this is incorrectly pronounced, but he calls himself an accoucheur or accouché, which is a French term for midwife, specifically male midwife. And what's interesting about that is in the 19th century, originally it's considered inappropriate for a man to attend a woman. And there's actually a famous English midwife whose last name is sadly Smelly. I know, Smellie.
Okay.
And he suggests that male midwives dress as women when delivering children to sort of preserve propriety. So being a male midwife, which is what Bennett actually calls himself, is seen as being salacious, and male midwives are often accused of trying to seduce women. Using their knowledge of the female body to seduce women, and then using their knowledge of reproduction to abort the children afterwards. And what's interesting, that matches exactly what John C. Bennett is accused of. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I think the community in Nauvoo, because of his profession, is already primed to see him that way.
Okay.
And so there's likely a bit of exaggeration going on there. As a male midwife, he would have been part of that transition away from women having control of their own reproduction towards male doctors, male midwives having control, and women losing that knowledge. Whether or not he's actually performing abortions, I don't know, but I think we also need to recognize that these women would have had their own methods, which would have been more or less successful.
Do you think that if he was helping women, because that's the accusation, that he was helping women have abortions, that these were medicinal methods for the most part?
So I don't know for sure. Having read his description, so he describes how to perform an abortion in his pamphlet, and what he describes is different than a medicinal abortion. So, and anyone who doesn't want to, this is really disturbing and has to do with a child dying during labor. So if anybody has issues, they should skip ahead if it's triggering for anyone. But in the 19th century and in the 20th century, sometimes women would have trouble delivering a child that was too large for their birth canal. And a child could get stuck. Women still have that problem. Yeah, well, so the next part, so in the 19th century, there were ways for midwives and doctors to try to help the woman give birth. Sometimes they would decide that this child and the mother were going to die, or they could sacrifice the child. And what John C. Bennett describes in his pamphlet is how to kill the child during labor and remove the remains, so that you don't lose both the mother and child. And this was not considered untoward during the 19th century. It was considered a sad but necessary procedure. And so he describes how to do that procedure. He doesn't talk about the medicinal part. And so it's possible that he did, but what he describes is a mechanical abortion where you're using a hook to, so that's what he describes. I don't know in general, doctors are less likely to use teas and herbs, but we do know that Pretty Meeks had like pills that were supposed to bring your labor faster. He tries to sell them in Utah. And so there's a possibility, and those pills could have been used for an abortion. That's not what Pretty Meeks is trying to do with them. But there's a possibility that Bennett would have had the same, but I don't know for sure. He doesn't talk about it. Yeah.
So Bennett would, because, I mean, to me, the implication is, oh, I'm pregnant, we don't want to start a scandal. So I don't think it would have been an issue where the baby was too big for the birth canal.
Right.
So in those cases, it probably would have been a medical abortion.
Mechanical.
A medical.
Oh, yeah.
Because the idea is you want to induce labor so that she doesn't have a big baby later. Wouldn't that be the case? Or I don't know. Because if the baby's 9 months and they're using a hook
he
to
would
get it
not
out,
have. So theoretically, he would not have let it go that long, right? If they are trying to avoid pregnancy altogether, you can do a mechanical abortion earlier.
Okay.
When those are done in the late 19th century, because women often die when they are getting those types of abortions.
Well, and I wonder if that's what happened with Lucy Stanton.
Okay. Yeah.
Warner McCary's wife.
Yeah.
Because I know she killed 2 women. I think she was in prison for manslaughter.
Yeah.
I don't believe Angela Pulley Hudson talks about how the procedures that were done. At least I don't remember that in the book. So I'm just curious to find out all the different methods, because so it sounds like in the 19th century, especially the 1840s, I want to focus on.
Yeah.
John C. Bennett era. So they had medicinal methods, they had mechanical methods. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Amanda Hendrix-Komoto. We're going to get very political, which is unusual for us here at Gospel Tangents, in our next conversation. And we're going to talk about modern abortion laws, so especially in Utah and Idaho. So you won't want to miss this conversation, but it's only available to newsletter subscribers. Go to gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and I'll send you a secret link to the final part of our conversation.
I recently got a call, which was interesting, about how overturning Roe has affected other types of women's health care, because in northern Idaho, and I don't know what's happening in Utah as much, but northern Idaho is losing a lot of OBGYNs, and hospitals are closing down maternity wards.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt, so check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.